Episode 260, Small Scale Grain Growing. This is Change Underground for the 13th of June 2021. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. At first sight, the idea of garden-scale grain seems a non-starter, but bear with me. There are basically two different types of classes of grain we can grow. Let's start with the fertile crescent grains and their relatives. Now, they were selected, as were all grains, with the technology the early farmers had at hand. As this technology developed, the seeds were selected to fit with that grain changing technology. This basically means for the fertile crescent grains, wheeled vehicles and draft animals. From sowing to harvesting, this technology suite affected every aspect of the grain's production. Seed drills to combine harvesters and silos all reflect this in later times. The end result of this is a grain cohort that requires threshing and winnowing at the very least, and many also require dehulling. These hulls are great at protecting the grain until it's ready for grinding into flour, but are a pain to remove at a small scale. And each of these steps requires a level of technology that is possible at the garden or smallholder level, but requires a little thought and a search through the past to find. Threshing, the removal of the seed from the seed head, can be achieved fairly simply by banging handfuls of harvested grain plants against the back of a chair or a beam set between two chairs and so on. A simple treadle-operated rotating set of wooden shafts against which to bang the seed also looks like an option. So with the old treadle sewing machines, instead of running the sewing machine, you use it to rotate a set of posts set on two wheels and separated from each other by these posts. And then you just lay the grain on it, and the moving timber bangs the seeds out rather than moving the seeds onto the timbers. Now, a quick search of YouTube does provide an eclectic series of solutions to this problem, from running it over with vehicles to using chains on fairly heavy chains, I might add, attached to dowels which are driven by handheld electric drills. The creativity of people is almost beyond belief, and yet there are many ways of doing this. So after the threshing, which leads to large amounts of trash, that is non-grain bits of the plant, being mixed in with the seeds, follows winnowing. This at its simplest can be achieved by throwing handfuls, basketfuls, bucketfuls of the threshed material into the air when it's windy, and dry, I might add. The non-seed bits blow away as they are lighter, and the seeds fall to the ground and you're left with your seed collection. Fans can also be used when there's no wind, and as ever, YouTubers provide a variety of intriguing solutions. Now, this leaves the dehulling problem, and it can be overcome by planting hull-less varieties, which appears to be easiest done with wheat. I did find a hull-less variety of barley back in the 1990s from a seed company here in Tasmania called Phoenix Seeds, but they've unfortunately gone out of business since then, and didn't have the variety every year anyway. So who's to know where it's available? And the other solution, of course, is to build a dehulling machine, the technological solution again. And if we go to YouTube, there appears to be three options: rollers, spinners and scrapers. Rollers uses two rubber-covered cylinders rotating in the same direction but at different speeds to rub the hull from the seeds. The spinners use centrifugal force, so basically a rotating disc that the seeds fall on and are then thrown out to the body of what's surrounding the disc, and the centrifugal force that throws the seeds against the hard surface knocks the hull from them. And scrapers use something like light sandpaper to gently rub the hull from the seeds. I'm drawn towards the roller solution if I can find an old-fashioned washing machine with a mangle on top that can be modified. The thing to remember is that dehulling is not required for animal feed, only for humans. So the, in inverted commas, only for human consumption grains need this process. In our case here in the glorious northwest of Tasmania, that will be wheat, spelt and buckwheat. Now, why bother to go to all this trouble? And I guess that's a fair question. You see, there is this thing I have, maybe because I studied archaeology, maybe it's just in me, but I like to trace things back to their origins. Felt a very strange sense of parallelism with the Neolithic farmers as I sowed these seeds by hand. That feeling and a desire to replicate a Fukuoka grain patch has always been high on my list of priorities. This and the idea that locally grown grains would produce bread with more flavour than commercial flour was also a driver. Time will tell. At the very least, I'll have plenty of grain for chooks and ducks. Now let's consider a grain selected using a different technology set. And here I'm talking about maize or Indian corn or just corn, depending on where you live. And I'll rotate between maize and corn because that's what I do. Corn was domesticated from a grass called teosinte, which was thought to be extinct until, 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago when it was discovered, growing in Mexico. Now, teosinte provides a couple of grains, maybe 3 in its seed head, but was a more useful as a plant for weaving material. Over time, through whatever selection pressure humans applied to this species, we ended up with the corn we have today. And we have 6 types that are now extant: popping corn, sweet corn, flour corn, flint corn, dent corn, and pod. Popcorn and sweet corn I think we can take as read. Most people know what they are. The same holds fairly true for flour corn. You'll need a mill to grind the seed, but the flour is something we've mostly seen before. Now, dent corn is the major commercial variety. Corn belts around the world grow this. When the seed dries sufficiently for harvesting, a small dent forms at the top of each kernel. And flint corn is, well, as hard as flint, hence the name. It has a very, very low water content. It can be used for popping or more usually for hominy, traditionally. Now, hominy is made by soaking flint corn in an alkaline solution, which is then washed off. The original solution was water and wood ash, known as lye, which is the same stuff you use in soap making. And then lastly, we come to that oddest one of all, pod corn. And I would suggest you have a Google search for pod corn. It is an oddity. Each kernel is wrapped in a leaf rather than having leaves over the whole kernel. Reintroduces the hulling problem of the fertile crescent grains. So it's probably not an option for the smaller grower, although I suspect these leaves will come off a lot easier than the hulls of barley and wheat. Hopefully some people are still growing it to maintain that massive genetic variation it contains, but I'll probably rule it out on a small scale. Whilst maize has been adopted for large-scale mechanical cultivation, combine harvesters and so on, it remains the obvious choice for the small-scale grain grower, and depending upon your location, many options open up. In the Americas, the choice is almost mind-bogglingly large. It was, of course, where the teosinte was domesticated into maize. So there's going to be a lot more variation closer to the original source, which seems to be a rule of thumb with domesticates. Elsewhere, the choices may be narrower, but still exciting enough. Here on the Apple Isle, as Tasmania is known, we have very tight biosecurity rules, so that even importing seed from the mainland can become prohibitively expensive. Yet there's always a way. Last year I ordered a couple of kilos of seed for home and work from a supplier in Queensland. They rang to let me know that the seed would need to go through biosecurity at that volume, but if I ordered in 800 gram lots, ordering again after the previous one had arrived, then there'd not be a problem. I went overboard and ended up bringing over 3 kilos this way just in case the rules change again and I've got some up my sleeve. And it turns out the same rules apply to the Egyptian dwarf broad beans I wanted to have, so there you go. Traps for young players when it comes to corn. Corn has a few peculiarities in its life cycle that need to be kept in mind. The plants are wind pollinated, Each of the silks that protrudes through the leaves around the cob links to just one kernel on the cob. These are the female parts. The tassels, which form at the very top of the plant, are the male parts, and they shed pollen into the wind. One grain of pollen for each strand of the silks, or you'll be missing kernels on the cob. So this means, and it can't fall on the same plant, it's got to fall on a different plant, otherwise it will be infertile. They are self-infertile plants. So this means three things. One, plant your corn in a block, not a long straight line of individual plants, unless of course you're going to hand pollinate, and why give yourself extra work. And two, if you're growing in a polytunnel or glasshouse, you will need to shake the plants to spread the pollen. A quick left right on the stem will see the pollen floating off. And finally, the third thing to bear in mind is if you don't want to cross-pollinate your corn, it must be at least 150 metres or 500 feet from other stands of the same species. The answer to that then would be to grow different varieties in different years if you want to save the seed. So last year I grew sweet corn, this year I'm growing flour corn when summer rolls around. Otherwise, just plant away and see what you get. Could be a great way to create a local variety. Mind you, managing to find a selection that throws true will take time, but it's probably worth the effort just to say that you've done it. So if you're going to grow grain on a small scale, I'd stick to the maize option, unless you're particularly contrarian or have a plan. How much grain you receive in the process is subject to way too many variables to give a definitive result. Currently I have oats, wheat, barley and spelt growing. The sudden burst of warm weather we've had this past week has pushed what should have been winter grains ready to harvest late next spring or early summer into producing seed heads on the oats and the spelt and the wheat, but not the barley, funnily enough. Hopefully they'll survive until the traditional warmer weather, and if that happens I'll provide yield data then. So have a crack if the idea appeals to you. It could be the start of a Fukuoka grain patch, which is definitely a regenerative practice, and something I'll work into the ChangeUnderground system as we go forward with actual physical testing. So if you go to the website worldorganicnews.com/free book, you can obtain a free copy of the ebook outlining the Change Underground system if you're interested. If you have any questions, thoughts or suggestions, there's the Facebook group, which I've called imaginatively Change Underground Podcast Group, which should make it easy to find. Quick search on Facebook, or there's a link in the show notes. And over in the transcript at worldorganicnews.com/episode 260. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.